The morning of October 27th arrived with an unnatural stillness in the isolated coastal town of Blackwood, Maine. Surrounded by towering, ancient pines and choked by a permanent Atlantic fog, Blackwood was a place where time seemed to have rusted. The air carried the sharp, biting chill of late autumn, and the cobblestone streets were carpeted with dead, rotting leaves. For any passing stranger, the town's 18th century wooden houses might have looked charmingly historic, but to the 300 people who lived there, every timber felt like a cage. Today was the day of the reaping, the annual harvest ritual that the townspeople looked forward to with a twisted mixture of dread and absolute devotion. According to the elders, 3 centuries ago, the founding families had struck a dark covenant with the barren land. The earth would grant them wealthy crops and prosperity, and in return, the town would feed the soil a single human soul each year. If the ritual ever stopped, the legend warned, the surrounding forest would reclaim Blackwood, and the town would choke to death in total ruin. As early as 9 in the morning, the children were the first to gather in the town square. School had recently closed for the autumn break, but there was no joy or laughter in their voices. They didn't speak of Halloween or games. Instead, they gathered in hushed, guarded tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the center of the square. Bobby Martin, a pale 10-year-old boy, silently bent down and pocketed a heavy, jagged piece of dark granite. Following his lead, the other children, David, Marcus, and little Jack, began searching the ground, selecting the sharpest, heaviest stones they could find. Within half an hour, they had built a massive, menacing pile of rocks against the old brick wall of the town hall. The smaller children sat on guard around the pile, protecting it like a precious, horrific treasure, unaware of whose body those stones would tear apart before the sun reached its peak. By mid-morning, the adults began to filter out of their homes. The men wore heavy flannel shirts, stained denim, and thick work jackets. They stood in small, tight clusters away from the pile of stones, talking in low, strained voices about tractor parts, rising fuel prices, and the upcoming winter. But their eyes betrayed them. Every few seconds, their gazes would helplessly drift to the center of the square, where a single 3-legged stool sat empty. When they smiled, their faces stretched tight with anxiety. Their laughter was hollow, lacking any genuine warmth. The women arrived next, wearing faded cardigans and heavy woolen coats. They exchanged brief bits of neighborhood gossip and quiet greetings as they joined their husbands. Soon, each family stood grouped together, a husband, his wife, and their children, standing shoulder to shoulder, gripping each other's hands so tightly that their knuckles turned white. It looked less like a community gathering and more like a collective execution squad waiting for a signal. The man who conducted the ritual was Mayor Thomas. He was a wealthy, stone-faced man who owned the local glass factory, and the townspeople followed him blindly out of fear and tradition. He arrived in the square carrying an ancient, badly scuffed black leather bag. Behind him walked Mr. Clark, the town postmaster, carrying the 3-legged stool. The stool was placed directly in the center of the square, and the crowd instantly fell back, leaving a wide, empty circle around it. The black leather bag was incredibly old. The leather had grown frayed and split over the decades, and it emitted a faint, unsettling odor of burnt charcoal. Inside the bag were exactly 300 tightly folded slips of paper, one for every living soul in Blackwood. The night before, Mayor Thomas and Mr. Clark had locked themselves in the back room of the post office, carefully cutting and folding the papers under the dim glow of a single lamp to ensure they were entirely identical. Just as Mayor Thomas cleared his throat to begin, a woman came running hurriedly down the foggy path into the square. It was Grace Miller, Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her woolen coat was thrown loosely over her shoulders. She slipped into the back of the crowd next to her closest neighbor, Nancy, and whispered breathlessly, "Clean forgot what day it was. I was out back washing the winter clothes, and then I looked up at the clock and realized it was almost 10. Thank God I made it in time." Nancy didn't smile. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead and replied coldly, "You're not late, Grace. They're just setting up the stool." Grace let out a nervous chuckle and made her way through the crowd to join her husband, David, and their 2 teenage children, Luke and Lily. As she took her place beside her family, the casual whispers of the crowd dissolved into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air felt thick, and the pale autumn sun offered no warmth, replaced by a sudden, unnatural chill that seemed to seep out of the very ground. Mayor Thomas adjusted his glasses and looked down at his master ledger. "Well, now," he said gravely, his voice echoing off the silent brick buildings. "Let's get started. The quicker we finish this, the sooner we can get back to our lives. The heads of each household will come up first and draw a slip of paper. Keep the paper folded firmly in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Is everyone ready?" From the front row, Old Man Vance, the oldest resident of Blackwood, snorted loudly. This was his 85th reaping. He leaned heavily on his cane and muttered to David Miller, "I heard some of those young fools over in the next county are talking about giving up the old ways, saying it's barbaric." "Pack of crazy idiots," Vance snapped under his breath, his face contorting with anger. "Listen to the youth, and next thing you know, we'll be starving in the woods. There's always been a reaping. The earth demands its blood, or the crops won't grow. If we stop, this whole town goes under." David Miller simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Adams." Mayor Thomas called out the first name. Mr. Adams stepped forward. The silence in the square was now so absolute that the rustle of his boots against the dead leaves sounded like thunder. He reached his hand into the dark, decaying interior of the leather bag, withdrew a single folded slip of paper, and walked quickly back to his family, staring straight ahead and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The names were called out in rapid, chilling succession: Baker, Carter, Davis, Evans, Foster, Gordon. One by one, the men stepped forward, reached into the ancient bag, took their chance with fate, and retreated back into the crowd. The women watched their husbands with wide, terrified eyes, clutching their children to their sides. Whenever a hand entered the bag, the crisp crinkle of shifting paper echoed through the square like the rattling of dry bones. Finally, the last name was called Zimmerman. The last man took his paper and stepped back. Mayor Thomas took a deep, shaky breath, held up his own hand, and addressed the crowd. "All right, folks. That's everyone. Open your papers." For a terrifying second, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, all at once, a flurry of movement erupted as 300 hands unfolded their papers. A wave of frantic whispers washed over the square. "Mine's blank. White here. What about you?" Then, the collective gaze of the crowd slowly shifted, turning toward the corner where the Miller family stood. David Miller was standing perfectly still, his face entirely drained of color. He was staring blankly down at the small slip of paper in his trembling hand. In the very center of the white paper, suddenly, Grace Miller screamed. Her voice was shrill and desperate, cracking with pure panic. "It isn't fair," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the stage. "It's not right. You didn't give him enough time to choose the paper he wanted. I saw you, Thomas. You hurried him. It isn't fair." Nancy, who had been speaking with Grace just minutes before, looked at her with a chillingly blank expression. "Be a good sport, Grace," she said, her voice dripping with artificial calm. "We all took the same chance. The Millers drew just like the rest of us." "Shut up, Grace," David muttered quietly, his head hanging low in resignation. "The rule is the rule." Mayor Thomas spoke with a sudden, icy professionalism. "Well, then, that completes the first draw. David, your household has been chosen. How many members do you have living under your roof?" "Just us four," David swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Me, Grace, and our 2 kids, Luke and Lily." "Clark," the mayor instructed the postmaster, "clear the bag. Take all the other slips out. Put exactly 4 slips back inside, 1 for each member of David's family." Mr. Clark emptied the leather bag, letting the hundreds of blank white papers drop to the cobblestones, where the autumn wind caught them and blew them away like dead butterflies. Inside the dark, hollow bag, he placed just 4 slips. One of them bore the black spot. Grace was hysterical now, pacing wildly within the small space the crowd had given them. "What about my eldest daughter, Megan? She lives across town with her husband. Make them draw too. She's still my blood." Mayor Thomas didn't look up from his ledger. "Tessie, you know the law as well as anyone. Married daughters draw with their husbands' families. That's how it's been for 300 years. It's not fair." Grace wept, her tears smudging the dirt on her face. It wasn't fair. The children were called forward first. 14-year-old Lily stepped up to the stool, her hand shaking violently as she reached into the bag and drew a slip. Next came 16-year-old Luke, his face pale and eyes wide with terror as he took his piece of paper. Then came Grace, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. With a sudden, desperate movement, she snatched a slip from the bag and hid it behind her back. Finally, David took the last remaining paper. The crowd held its breath. The silence was suffocating. Mr. Clark opened Lily's paper first. It was completely blank and white. A collective sigh of relief washed through the crowd, and Lily burst into tears, stepping back. Next, he opened Luke's paper. Blank. There were only 2 left, David and Grace. David opened his hand and looked at his paper. It was white. Without saying a word, David walked over to his wife. As she wept, he firmly pried her frozen fingers open and snatched the paper from her hand. He opened it and held it high for the entire town to see. In the center of the paper was the irregular charcoal circle. The earth had chosen Grace Miller. "All right, folks," Mayor Thomas commanded, his voice brisk and businesslike. "Let's finish this up before the fog gets too thick." In an instant, the peaceful, neighborly atmosphere of Blackwood vanished entirely. The friendly greetings, the smiles, and the small-town warmth of the morning were gone, replaced by a primal, bloodthirsty zeal. The children rushed toward the great pile of stones in the corner of the square. Nancy, Grace's longtime neighbor, selected a granite stone so large she had to lift it with both hands. She turned to another woman and said urgently, "Come on, hurry up. We don't want to be late getting the kids fed." The villagers quickly formed a large, tight circle around Grace Miller, moving in on her slowly. Grace stood entirely alone in the center of the clearing, her hands clawing at the air as she backed away in horror. "It isn't fair. It's not right," Grace screamed, her voice echoing desperately off the cold brick walls. Suddenly, a small, sharp stone caught her on the side of the head, cutting her temple. A thin line of bright red blood began to run down her face. To her horror, she looked over and saw that someone had slipped a few small pebbles into her own children's hands. Terrified of breaking the town's ancient law, Luke and Lily stood there, tears streaming down their faces, throwing their pebbles toward their mother because everyone else was doing it. Old Man Vance led the crowd, moving in close, his voice cracked with ancient, terrifying enthusiasm. "Come on, everyone. Keep moving. We need a good harvest." Grace looked up at the grey, indifferent New England sky one last time, her voice desperate, completely swallowed by the thud of dozens of heavy boots closing in. "It isn't fair. It's not right. I tell you, it isn't." And then, a heavy volley of stones rose into the air, blotting out the light for a fraction of a second, and came raining down upon her. The entire town, friends, neighbors, and her own family, participated in the brutal, ancient ritual, completely indifferent to her cries, driven only by the blind force of a tradition they no longer even understood. The fog continued to roll in, and in that quiet American town, the reaping was over, just in time for lunch.